Hey, this is AP Lit, and we had a discussion today on the poem Convergence of the Twain. I gave back the papers and gave the students an opportunity to get a few extra points by sort of describing what we were about to talk about, summarizing some of the ideas that they may have missed in the poem. So we're going to videotape this for AP Lit, and so let me get it started. I don't think you can see it, but anyway, the prompt was about finding the attitude the speaker had toward his the sinking of the Titanic. And I know it's hard to see it from the front of the board. I'll try to get a little closer maybe. Okay, that's better. All right, so we'll start with this attitude at the title of the poem, which there are two aspects of this that are worth noting. One, that if I were writing this poem, I would call it a tragedy on the high seas or disaster in the North Atlantic, something pretty sensational. But this is just the opposite of sensational. In fact, you may not even understand what the title means. You have to understand what the word divergence and the word Twain means too. So it's an odd way to describe something that's very sensational and dramatic, which hints at the tone or attitude that the speaker has throughout the poem, and that is one that is muted, detached, indifferent, or mocking. Those words actually came from one of my students that describe his attitude. Plus, that attitude is conveyed through the high diction. So we're having to look at poetic devices. That's an example of high diction that creates an attitude of kind of indifference and detachment. The other thing that would note from the beginning is the chronology of the poem. A lot of people overlook this. The first 5 stanzas deal with the aftermath of the sinking, and then the last 6 or 7 deal with or before it sank, the origin of the ship. And so we just look for a minute at some of these details. Again, always looking at literary devices that suggest attitude. First of all, this is a clue that it's underwater. The word deep is there, and it reminds us they're not on the water, they're under the water. The pride of life suggests the problem that's set up throughout the whole poem, and that is it's pride that built the ship, and it's pride that actually sunk her. So that's how it starts. There are about 4 images here that we need to deal with at the beginning of the poem that all help contribute to the attitude. One is the steel chambers, and the other is the mirror that we can see here. We'll just take those 2 and then move it up. The steel chambers are the furnaces of the ship, which are now underwater. And one of the other elements that is used here is the element of contrast. You've got the chambers that used to be where the fires were. The fires have now become pyres, which is an example of the carefully chosen diction that suggests, of course, funeral and death. The salamandrian aspect of it brings out the idea of irony, because the salamander was supposed to be able to live in fire, survive fire, just like the Titanic was supposed to be able to survive. Couldn't sink because it could survive any disaster, and of course that's not what happened. So you have this idea of contrast, the fire that was supposed to be there versus the coal that's now there, the cold water underwater. you have the fires, then you have the mirrors, you have the jewels, and you have the fish. These are the four images, well, the mirrors and so I guess you could say there are five. So we go to the mirrors. All these are aspects of the interior of the ship that when it was sailing, made it a very opulent or rich vessel. But again, you have that contrast between the mirrors that were meant to reflect, rich people. Instead, now they simply reflect crawling sea worms. And the word indifferent also suggests, and dumb or interesting, again, we're talking about diction, suggests what the attitude of the poem or the poet is. He seems to be indifferent to the deaths. He's not indifferent to what caused the deaths, but he never mentions the people who die. So the sea worms are indifferent, they're dumb. Should point out too that you should always look for the literal before you go to the figurative. So they're actually sea worms here, they're actual mirrors, they're actually jewels. A lot of students went directly to the figurative and missed the fact that these are actual aspects of the ship underwater. So you start with the literal and deal with that, and then you see what do these represent. The jewels, again, the contrast between mirrors and sea worms, jewels, they're supposed to be bright, and now that they are lightless, so that contrast. And then the fish are making a comment about the ship by saying, what is this vainglorious? Again, an example of high diction that gives it, again, kind of a formal, objective, but even mocking tone. So you have these 4 or 5 images, the use of particular words that create a contrast between what the ship used to be and what it is now. The rest of the poem was easier for the students to note. Now that we've realized that the ship has sunk, the poet goes to its building and its origin. So you have the kind of the contrast again between the builders who were proud and God, referred to here as the immanent will. So you have that contrast. You have the ship being prepared, and again, you use the marriage imagery. A lot of people notice that, which just seems odd for this tragedy. But you see this contrast between the ship being built and the ice being built at the same time. Here's another example of diction. You remember it was the sea worms that were grotesque, slime, and dumb versus the ship that was smart. And you again have these two things happening at the same time. And again, most people notice that these two things are like headed to the same point, and they notice things like welding, which makes you think of wedding. There's another example of how diction is so important. Why he chooses this wedding thing is something I'm not sure I can answer, but it works. Here's another example of diction, an old word that creates this indifference toward the subject. And at the end, this key phrase, you have this, which has to do with marriage, jarring two hemispheres. The poem literally is about the coming together of two things. The two hemispheres, again, a use of diction, because it could mean several things. It could be Europe, where the ship was built, and America, where it was headed. It could be the pride of life, the people that built it, versus the awesome majesty of God. It could be the above the water and below the water. Those are two hemispheres, and we know now that the ship actually broke into two parts as it sank beneath the ocean. So just kind of a summary of what we just did. Starting with the title, we have this indifferent, mocking, muted, detached attitude toward the sinking, sort of anger toward the builders who in their pride ignored all the signs and were very careless. And then all the details at the beginning of the different images and the contrast used there suggest the two things again, the two main ideas in the poem. And then you have the elevated diction that creates that aloof kind of detached attitude. And so ultimately, when it comes down to it, you have this this conflict between the pride of life and the awesomeness of God. So I hope this is helpful to any of you that still needed some help with this poem. Thank you.